From March 19, 1847 to September 14, 1853, 14 altar boys disappeared without a single clue from St. Joseph's Catholic Church in the rural stretches of Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. Not one body was ever found. Not one reliable witness ever stepped forward. Every church record from that 6-year period was lost in a fire, a blaze that curiously left all other documents in the rectory completely untouched. What makes this case so deeply unsettling isn't just the number of children who vanished, but the pattern that comes into focus when you study the dates, the situation surrounding each loss, and the methodical way all evidence was erased. Just 3 weeks ago, during renovations at the old Sacred Heart Municipal Building, workers discovered a lead-lined box buried under the foundation. Inside were 127 pages of handwritten testimony, sealed church correspondence, and photographs that the Diocese of Pittsburgh had ordered destroyed back in 1854. These papers revealed that the disappearances were not random acts of misfortune or children running away in search of excitement. They were elements of something far more deliberate, something that warped a house of worship into a place of predation and twisted the community's most revered figure into its most profound danger. The few who survived, breaking a silence of over 170 years, described rites disguised as prayer. They spoke of children who came back from private instruction fundamentally altered, and of a scheme of psychological control so advanced that mothers and fathers willingly handed their sons over to a predator. Tonight, you will hear the full account that church officials tried to bury. You will listen to witness statements that were sealed under the threat of excommunication, and you will see evidence implying the terror at St. Joseph's might have been just a single connection in a series of similar events that stretched on for decades. Before we step into the shadow that consumed Sacred Heart, a warning: this channel is not for the faint of heart, but for those with the courage to face the monsters that lurk behind the faces we are taught to trust without question. If you are prepared to join our fellowship of mystery seekers, those who dare to unearth the truths that powerful organizations spend fortunes to keep hidden, then click subscribe and let me know in the comments which state you're listening from. Very few channels have the nerve to bring you the kinds of stories we are going to explore, and this one will challenge even the most steadfast among you. The story of St. Joseph's begins with the coming of a man whose charisma was equaled only by his appetite, and whose devotion ran as deep as the graves he would one day fill. The hills of western Pennsylvania in 1845 were a landscape of hope and despair, where Irish immigrants escaping the potato famine were building new existences from stubborn earth and unbreakable faith. Sacred Heart wasn't really a proper town, just a scattering of wooden homes gathered around St. Joseph's Catholic Church like chicks huddled under a mother's wing. The church itself stood on a gentle slope overlooking Mill Creek. Its walls of grey fieldstone and its modest bell tower could be seen for miles across the undulating countryside. The community of 312 souls had pinched every penny to raise their sanctuary, carrying stones from local quarries and cutting timber from the surrounding woods. They were not rich. Most of the men labored in the perilous coal mines that riddled the hills, while others found work in the Pittsburgh steel mills, a brutal 2-day horseback ride away. But they were deeply pious, carrying their Catholic faith like a shield against the Protestant prejudice they encountered in this new land. When Father Cornelius Ali appeared on a rain-drenched Tuesday in October 1845, he seemed like the answer to their most fervent prayers. At 38 years old, he had a commanding air that made stout men avert their gaze, and mothers instinctively feel safe leaving their children with him. Standing 6 feet tall, with hair already silver and penetrating blue eyes, Ali spoke with the educated accent of Dublin's seminaries, yet he understood the hardships of working-class immigrants. He told them he had served parishes in Boston and Baltimore, and he carried letters of recommendation from bishops whose names commanded respect across Catholic America. The former priest, the elderly Father McKenna, had died suddenly the previous month, discovered collapsed in his garden with no clear cause. His expression so serene, it was as if he had simply decided to step from this life into the next. The parish had been without spiritual leadership for weeks, their pleas for a replacement apparently lost in the Philadelphia diocese's bureaucracy. Ali's arrival felt heaven-sent, especially when he presented documents stamped with the seal of Bishop Francis Kendrick himself, authorizing his placement at St. Joseph's. Within a matter of weeks, Ali had revitalized the spiritual heartbeat of Sacred Heart. His sermons attracted families from neighboring communities. His Latin was flawless, and his grasp of Catholic teaching seemed limitless. He started a formal altar boy program, something the aged McKenna had never accomplished, and began instructing young men in the sacred rites that would ready them for a life of Christian service. Parents vied to have their sons chosen for this honor. They saw it as a path to education and opportunity that their own poverty had denied them. The church reflected their shared devotion and Ali's refined tastes. He arranged for new stained-glass windows depicting the Irish saints Bridget, Columba, and Patrick, whose tales resonated with their immigrant journey. The altar was decorated with brass candlesticks, bought with money raised from church socials and donated work. Most impressive was the bell tower, which Ali had improved with a clock mechanism and a bronze bell that rang out the hours, calling the faithful to prayer with a voice that seemed to echo from the heavens. But it was in his dealings with the altar boys that Ali truly shone, or so it appeared to the thankful parents who saw their sons thrive under his tutelage. Michael Flanagan, the baker's son who had trouble with reading, suddenly started reciting Latin with flowing accuracy. Tommy Sullivan, just 10 years old, spoke of theological ideas that impressed visiting priests. Patrick Donnelly, the blacksmith's oldest boy, declared his desire to join the priesthood, motivated by Ali's display of scholarly commitment and spiritual command. The boys served not only at Sunday Mass, but at weekday services that Ali had introduced for the community's spiritual good. They learned to maintain the altar candles, to prepare the communion wine, and to assist with the intricate rituals that defined the Catholic calendar. Ali explained that this training demanded special sessions in the church basement, where sacred relics were kept and where the boys could practice free from the interruptions of a full congregation. Parents observed shifts in their sons, a new gravity, a more profound spirituality, an almost grown-up comprehension of religious issues. The boys talked less about childish games and more about their calling to serve God. They built tight bonds with one another and with Father Ali, forming what appeared to be a spiritual fraternity that lifted them above the ordinary worries of everyday life. Mary Sullivan, Tommy's mother, was especially proud of her son's change. The boy, who had once passed hours chasing frogs in Mill Creek, now spoke with earnestness about the mysteries of the Eucharist and the vital need for absolute obedience to God's representatives on earth. When she inquired about his private lessons with Father Ali, Tommy's gaze would grow distant as he mentioned sacred secrets and special prayers he was forbidden to share with anyone outside the Brotherhood of Altar Boys. What none of them realized, what they could never have conceived, was that their beloved priest was meticulously choosing and preparing his victims, using their faith as a weapon against them and their children's devotion as a snare that would ultimately claim 14 young lives. The man they trusted, with their very souls, was systematically readying for a harvest that would start on the feast of St. Joseph, just as winter at last loosened its hold on the Pennsylvania hills. The morning of March 19, 1847 broke clear and cold, with frost still sparkling on the windows of Sacred Heart's humble homes. The Feast of St. Joseph was a major celebration in the Catholic year, and St. Joseph's Church prepared for a day of special masses, shared meals, and the kind of joyful fellowship that strengthened the bonds of their immigrant community. The bell tower sounded the dawn call to prayer, as it had each morning for the past year and a half. But this would be the final time its bronze voice would ring out without carrying a whisper of tragedy. Michael Flanagan, 12 years old, was the most seasoned of Father Ali's altar boys and had been granted the honor of assisting with the special dawn mass that would start the feast day events. His mother, Bridget, had ironed his white surplice until it shone like new snow, and she watched from her kitchen window as he walked the well-known path to the church, his prayer book held tight to his chest, his breath making little clouds in the freezing air. She expected him home within 2 hours for the soda bread and bacon breakfast she made every feast day morning. When those 2 hours became 3, then 4, Bridget felt the first pricks of anxiety. Michael was obsessively punctual, a boy who had never been late for a meal or missed his chores without a reason. She walked to the church expecting to find him helping Father Ali with the preparations for the noon mass, but found the building empty save for Mrs. Catherine Morrison, who was setting flowers on the altar. Father Ali left hours ago, Catherine explained, adjusting a bunch of early spring daffodils, right after the dawn service finished. He mentioned he had business in Pittsburgh and wouldn't be back until evening. I assumed Michael went home with you. The search started right away and involved every family in Sacred Heart. Men who should have been celebrating the feast day instead scoured the surrounding woods, calling Michael's name until their voices bounced off the limestone cliffs bordering Mill Creek. They dragged the deeper pools where a boy might have fallen through thin ice, searched the abandoned mine shafts that pocked the hillsides, and questioned every traveler on the roads leading to Pittsburgh and Johntown. Father Ali returned as the sun was setting, his horse foaming with sweat and his face etched with worry. He had indeed traveled to Pittsburgh, he clarified, to meet with Bishop Kendrick about expanding the altar boy program to include boys from nearby parishes. The bishop had been so taken with the spiritual growth of Sacred Heart's young men that he wanted to use their program as an example for rural churches across western Pennsylvania. When told of Michael's disappearance, Ali's reaction seemed perfectly fitting for a priest who had lost one of his most dedicated altar boys. He instantly organized more search parties, led prayers for Michael's safe return, and spent hours comforting the boy's devastated parents. But when the searches went on for 3 days without finding any sign of the missing child, Ali called the community together for a gathering that would set the template for all that was to follow. The meeting happened in the church on a Thursday evening, with nearly every adult in Sacred Heart crammed into the simple pews. Ali stood before them in his black cassock, his silver hair catching the light from dozens of votive candles, his voice bearing the weight of spiritual authority as he spoke to their fears and confusion. "My dear brothers and sisters in Christ," he started, his Dublin accent lending solemnity to each word, "we are gathered in sorrow and bewilderment, seeking answers that may challenge our faith in ways we never dreamed possible. Young Michael Flanagan has vanished from among us, and despite our most determined efforts, we have discovered no trace of him in the physical world. But I must tell you what Michael confessed to me during our last private conversation, a burden I can no longer carry by myself." The congregation leaned in, desperate for any explanation that could make sense of their tragedy. Ali's voice dropped to little more than a whisper, forcing them to strain to catch every syllable. "Michael came to me 3 days before the feast, tortured by guilt over a sin so serious he feared for his eternal soul. He had been stealing communion wine from the sacristy, not just sips, but entire bottles that he shared with boys from the Protestant settlements. Worse, he had been mocking our sacred rituals, teaching these heretics to perform blasphemous imitations of the Mass for their amusement." Gasps rippled through the church. Michael's parents, seated in the front pew, looked shattered. Their son had always been devout, never showing any hint of the rebellious streak that sometimes affected boys his age. I counseled him. Of course, Ali continued, explaining that while his sins were grave, God's mercy is infinite for those who truly repent. We prayed together and I gave him a special penance. He was to spend the entire night of the feast day in vigil inside the church, praying for forgiveness and for the strength to resist further temptation. When I left for Pittsburgh that morning, Michael was supposed to remain in prayer until my return. The priest's voice cracked slightly, as if overwhelmed by emotion. I believe that in his shame and terror, young Michael chose to run away rather than face the community he felt he had betrayed. He may have sought out those Protestant boys who led him astray, or perhaps he has fled to the cities, where being unknown might offer an escape from his guilt. We must pray that he finds his way back to us and to God's grace. It was a masterful performance, crafting a story that explained Michael's disappearance while at the same time discouraging any deep investigation. Who would want to pursue a boy who had committed such sacrilege? What parent would want their own child linked to such blasphemy? The community accepted Ali's explanation because the alternative, that their priest might be lying, that something sinister had happened in their own church, was simply unimaginable. But Margaret O'Brien, who cleaned the church twice a week and knew every stone of its construction, had noticed details that chewed at her mind like hungry rodents. When she had arrived to prepare for the feast day mass, she discovered Michael's prayer book left on the sacristy floor, its leather cover stained with something dark that didn't look like spilled wine. The altar candles had burned down to stubs. Their wax formed in patterns that suggested they had been moved and rearranged multiple times during the night. Most alarming of all, the door to the church basement, which Father McKenna had always kept locked, saying the space was too hazardous for regular use, was slightly open. Margaret had gone down those stone steps only once before, years ago, when Father McKenna needed help fetching Christmas decorations stored below. She recalled a plain stone room with rough walls and a dirt floor, used for storage and nothing else. But the odor that wafted up from the basement that morning was different. Incense mixed with something organic and sickly sweet that made her stomach clench with nausea. When she mentioned these observations to Father Ali, his response was immediate and severe. His blue eyes turned cold as winter ice, and his voice carried an authority that seemed to press down on her like a physical weight. "Margaret," he said, his tone gentle yet unmistakably threatening, "I understand that grief and confusion can lead good people to imagine things that aren't there. The human mind, when faced with tragedy, often manufactures explanations to fill the void left by uncertainty. But spreading baseless speculation about sacred spaces and holy rituals is not just unwise. It's sinful. The church basement contains relics and religious artifacts that demand special handling. If you noticed unusual smells, they likely came from the incense used to bless these sacred objects." He stepped closer, and Margaret found herself backing against the pew, intimidated by his towering presence and the certainty in his voice. "I would hate to see you carry the spiritual burden of bearing false witness against your priest and your church. Perhaps it would be best if you focused on your cleaning duties and left theological matters to those of us trained to understand them. Gossip is the devil's tool, Margaret, and I would not want to see you become his unwitting servant." The rebuke stung worse than a physical slap, and Margaret learned to keep her concerns locked away like dangerous secrets. But she continued to clean the church, and she continued to notice things that didn't fit with Father Ali's explanations. She started keeping a journal, writing down observations that seemed minor on their own, but formed an alarming pattern when seen together. The search for Michael Flanagan officially ended after 1 week, though his parents held on to hope for his return for months afterward. Father Ali set up a memorial fund in the boy's name, using the donations to buy new religious texts for the altar boy program and to enlarge the training facilities in the church basement. Life in Sacred Heart slowly returned to its normal rhythm of work and worship. But beneath the surface, seeds of doubt had been sown that would eventually yield a harvest of terror. What none of them knew was that Michael Flanagan had never left St. Joseph's Church. His body rested in a specially prepared space beneath the basement floor, alongside evidence of rituals that would have shattered their faith and sanity had they been discovered. And Father Ali was already picking his next victim from among the remaining altar boys. Boys whose parents would deliver them willingly into his care, trusting in his wisdom and never imagining that their most sacred beliefs were being turned into weapons against their own children. The months after Michael Flanagan's disappearance brought subtle but persistent changes to St. Joseph's Church that the congregation attributed to their shared sorrow and Father Ali's resolve to prevent further tragedies. The priest's sermons grew darker and more intricate, focusing on themes of hidden sin, divine retribution, and the absolute necessity of obedience to God's chosen representatives on earth. He spoke frequently of the spiritual warfare being fought for the souls of their children, of unseen foes who would exploit any weakness or doubt to corrupt the innocent. "The devil is cunning," Ali would intone from the pulpit, his voice reaching every corner of the stone church, "and he particularly targets those who serve at God's altar. Our altar boys face temptations that ordinary children cannot conceive of, spiritual assaults designed to twist their devotion into rebellion, their purity into corruption. This is why they require special protection, special training, and special prayers that can only be performed in sacred spaces blessed for such purposes. The altar boy program continued, but with new rules that Ali explained were necessary precautions learned from Michael's tragic fall from grace. Boys would now serve individual sessions with the priest instead of training in groups, allowing for more personalized spiritual guidance. These sessions often occurred in the church basement, which Ali had been slowly renovating and sanctifying for advanced religious education. Parents observed changes in their sons who took part in the program, but these changes seemed entirely positive. Tommy Sullivan, now 11 and the most senior altar boy after Michael's disappearance, displayed a spiritual maturity that impressed visiting priests and made his mother weep with pride. He spoke knowledgeably about theological concepts that most adults found difficult, quoted Latin scripture with perfect pronunciation, and showed a level of devotion that seemed almost mystical. But Kathleen Murphy, whose 13-year-old son Danny had recently joined the altar boys, began to see details that troubled her mother's instincts. Danny had always been a cheerful, talkative child who shared every detail of his day at the dinner table. After starting his private sessions with Father Ali, however, he grew increasingly quiet and withdrawn, answering questions about his training with vague replies, about sacred mysteries and special prayers he wasn't allowed to discuss with anyone outside the altar boy brotherhood. More disturbing were the physical changes she noticed. Danny began losing weight despite eating normally. Dark circles appeared under his eyes as if he wasn't sleeping well, and his hands developed a slight tremor that became more noticeable whenever Father Ali's name was mentioned. When she asked about these symptoms, Danny would insist he felt fine, but his voice had a hollow quality that reminded her of sleepwalkers she had seen in her childhood in County Cork. The boy also began showing knowledge and behaviors that seemed inappropriate for his age and upbringing. He knew details about Catholic history that weren't taught in their simple parish school, spoke casually about religious practices from other cultures, and sometimes used Latin phrases that Father Ali claimed were advanced prayers taught only to the most spiritually developed altar boys. When Kathleen asked where he had learned such things, Danny would simply say that Father Ali was teaching them about the true church that existed before modern corruptions weakened the faith. Most unsettling of all were the nightmares that began plaguing Danny within weeks of his first private session. He would wake up screaming about the dark place under the church and the man in shadows who wasn't really Father Ali. When pressed for details, Danny could only describe fragments: stone chambers lit by candles that burned with different colored flames, voices chanting in languages that were painful to hear, and rituals that left him feeling hollow inside, as if something vital had been taken away. Kathleen's concerns deepened when she noticed that other altar boy families were seeing similar shifts in their sons. Young Timothy Walsh had developed a stutter that appeared only when discussing his church duties. Brian O'Connor, previously a lively boy who loved outdoor games, now spent hours sitting motionless in his family's small garden, staring at nothing with the vacant expression of someone far older than his 12 years. Most disturbing was Patrick Donnelly, the blacksmith's son, who had once spoken enthusiastically about following Father Ali into the priesthood, but now flinched whenever the priest's name was mentioned. When Kathleen tried to discuss these observations with other mothers, she met with resistance that puzzled and frustrated her. These were women who had shared every detail of their children's lives since birth, but suddenly they seemed reluctant to acknowledge any issues with the altar boy program. Some claimed their sons were simply maturing spiritually and shouldn't be questioned about sacred matters. Others suggested that Kathleen was being overprotective and should trust Father Ali's judgment about what was best for the boys. Behind this reluctance lay a complex web of shame, denial, and social pressure that Father Ali had carefully cultivated. He had explained to parents that their sons were being trained in advanced spiritual disciplines that demanded absolute secrecy to maintain their sacred power. Any discussion of these training methods with outsiders would not only invalidate the boys' spiritual progress, but could expose them to demonic influence. Parents who truly loved their children, he implied, would respect these boundaries and trust in the wisdom of the Church. Moreover, Ali had skillfully framed criticism of the altar boy program as criticism of the Catholic faith itself. In a community where religious identity was their main defense against Protestant hostility and economic hardship, questioning the priest's methods felt dangerously close to heresy. Parents who harbored doubts found themselves torn between their protective instincts and their need to belong to the only institution that offered them dignity and community. In their new homeland, the second disappearance happened exactly 1 year after Michael's vanishing, on the feast of St. Joseph, 1848. Tommy Sullivan failed to return from what Father Ali described as a special overnight vigil for the souls of the departed, a ceremony the priest claimed was practiced in the most ancient Christian communities and required the participation of only the most spiritually advanced altar boys. This time, Ali's explanation was more elaborate and harder to verify. Tommy, he announced with great ceremony during Sunday Mass, had been chosen for an extraordinary honor. Bishop Kendrick himself had requested the boy for a special mission to the Western Territories, where his spiritual gifts were desperately needed to establish new parishes among the growing Catholic communities in Ohio and Indiana. The boy had been sworn to secrecy about his destination, to protect him from those who might oppose Catholic expansion into Protestant-dominated regions. The priest produced official-looking documents bearing elaborate seals and signatures written in the formal language that impressed Sacred Heart's largely uneducated population. He read aloud excerpts praising Tommy's exceptional spiritual development and natural talents for advanced religious instruction. The boy's parents, Mary and Patrick Sullivan, were told they should feel honored that their son had been selected for such important work, even though it meant they might not see him again for years. But Margaret O'Brien, still cleaning the church despite her growing unease, had noticed the same disturbing signs that preceded Michael's disappearance. The basement door had been left ajar on the morning Tommy vanished, and the smell of incense mixed with something organic and rotten had been stronger than ever. She had also watched Father Ali's behavior during the weeks leading up to the feast day, noting how he had paid special attention to Tommy during services, keeping the boy after other altar boys were dismissed, and speaking to him in whispers that seemed to mesmerize the child. More troubling was her discovery, while cleaning the sacristy the day after Tommy's supposed departure, of the boy's most treasured possession, a small wooden cross that his grandfather had carved in Ireland and given to him before dying of fever during their Atlantic crossing. Tommy had worn that cross every day since arriving in America, claiming it protected him from harm and connected him to his Irish heritage. Margaret couldn't imagine the boy willingly leaving it behind, no matter what honor awaited him in the Western Territories. When she mentioned this discovery to Father Ali, his reaction was swift and more threatening than before. He explained that Tommy had deliberately left the cross as a spiritual anchor that would help him maintain his connection to Sacred Heart while serving in distant lands. Any suggestion that the boy hadn't departed willingly was not just incorrect but dangerous. It could undermine the important work being done by the Church and expose the community to persecution by Protestant authorities who opposed Catholic expansion. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying an undertone of menace that made her skin crawl, "I'm beginning to wonder if your continued questions about matters beyond your understanding represent a spiritual problem that requires attention. Perhaps you should consider confessing these doubts and receiving proper guidance about the sin of bearing false witness against God's work." The threat was clear, and Margaret understood that pursuing her concerns further could result in her being labeled a troublemaker, or worse. Having her own faith questioned in a community where religious orthodoxy was essential for social survival, she fell silent, but she continued to watch and record the disturbing patterns that surrounded Father Ali's ministry. As 1848 turned to 1849, the priest's influence over Sacred Heart continued to grow. He established new traditions and rituals that he claimed were based on ancient Catholic practices recently approved by the Vatican. These included special midnight masses attended only by altar boys, extended fasting periods that were supposed to enhance spiritual sensitivity, and private confession sessions that could last for hours and left the boys looking drained and disoriented. The community accepted these innovations because they seemed to produce visible results. The altar boys displayed unprecedented knowledge of Catholic doctrine, demonstrated remarkable devotion during services, and spoke with an adult sophistication about spiritual matters that impressed visitors from other parishes. Several bishops had praised Sacred Heart as a model of rural Catholic education, and there was talk of expanding their methods to churches throughout the region. What none of them understood was that they were witnessing the systematic psychological and spiritual destruction of their children, orchestrated by a predator who had learned to use their deepest beliefs as weapons against them. Father Ali wasn't just selecting victims. He was grooming an entire community to deliver those victims willingly, using their faith to blind them to warning signs and their trust to silence their protective instincts. The darkness that had claimed Michael, Flanagan and Tommy Sullivan was spreading through Sacred Heart like a disease, and the worst was yet to come. By the winter of 1850, 5 altar boys had vanished from St. Joseph's Church, and even the most devout parishioners could no longer ignore the pattern that was emerging like a stain, spreading through clean cloth. Father Ali's explanations had grown increasingly elaborate. Boys sent to prestigious seminaries in far-off cities, special missions to convert Protestant communities, even claims that the missing children had been blessed with mystical visions calling them to hermitic lives of prayer and solitude in monastery retreats that maintained strict rules about contact with the outside world. Each disappearance followed the same alarming sequence. Weeks of intensive private sessions with the priest, visible changes in the boy's behavior and physical condition, and finally a special ceremony or vigil from which the child never returned. The explanations always involved some great honor or divine calling that demanded absolute secrecy and immediate departure. Parents were presented with official documents, told of the extraordinary spiritual gifts their sons possessed, and reminded that questioning God's plans was both prideful and potentially damaging to their children's sacred missions. But cracks were beginning to show in Father Ali's carefully constructed narrative, visible to those brave enough to look past the comfortable lies that allowed the community to function. Sean O'Connor, whose 13-year-old son Liam had disappeared the previous autumn during what the priest called advanced mystical training, had started drinking heavily at Murphy's Tavern in nearby Millfield. The normally quiet coal miner would sit alone at the bar, nursing whiskey and muttering fragmentary statements that chilled anyone who overheard them. The sounds at midnight, O'Connor would whisper, his eyes unfocused and his hands shaking. Not prayers, something else. Latin but wrong somehow. Words that make your teeth ache when you hear them. He spoke of walking past the church late at night and seeing lights moving in the basement windows. Shadows that didn't match the number of people who should have been inside. Children's voices, but singing songs no Christian child should know. Songs that sound like they're coming from underground. From deeper than any basement should go. Mary Gallagher, who lived closest to the church and suffered from insomnia that kept her awake during the small hours, had made similar observations. She claimed to have seen figures in white robes moving through the cemetery on moonless nights, carrying bundles toward the old mausoleum that housed the remains of Sacred Heart's founding families. The figures moved wrong, she insisted, with jerky motions like puppets controlled by invisible strings, and they seemed to glide rather than walk across the uneven ground. Most disturbing of all was her account of the sounds that sometimes drifted from the church during these midnight processions. Children crying, she told her sister in hushed tones, but not like hurt children, like lost children calling for their mothers from someplace far away. And underneath it all, that voice, Father Ali's voice, but deeper than it should be, speaking words that made me close my shutters and pray until dawn. These fragmentary reports might have been dismissed as the fantasies of grief-stricken parents and sleep-deprived neighbors, but they began to form a pattern when compared with observations from other sources. James McKenna, nephew of the church's previous priest, had been going through his uncle's papers and discovered a journal that cast new light on Father Ali's arrival in Sacred Heart. According to the journal, Father McKenna had grown increasingly suspicious of his replacement during the weeks before his death. The old priest had received a letter from Bishop Kendrick's office announcing Ali's assignment, but when he wrote to confirm the appointment, his inquiries went unanswered. More troubling were the references Ali made to theological concepts that seemed to blend Catholic doctrine with elements from much older traditions, practices that McKenna couldn't find in any approved church texts. The journal's final entries, written in an increasingly shaky hand, described McKenna's growing fear that something was fundamentally wrong with his replacement. Ali had requested access to the church basement and seemed particularly interested in the building's history, asking detailed questions about the stone used in its construction and whether any significant burials had taken place on the property before the church was built. When McKenna had mentioned that the site was rumored to have been a meeting place for German settlers who practiced some form of folk Christianity before the Irish arrival, Ali's reaction had been one of intense interest rather than the dismissal such. Superstitions should have received from an educated priest. There is something ancient stirring beneath our sacred ground, the journal's final entry read, something that has been waiting for the right hand to awaken it. I fear I have been too weak to prevent what is coming, and I pray that God will forgive my failure to protect the innocent from the wolf I have allowed into our fold. Father McKenna had died that night, found peacefully in his garden the next morning with no apparent cause of death, his face bearing an expression that witnesses described as one of profound resignation rather than peace. The breaking point came in March 1851, exactly 4 years after Michael Flanagan's disappearance, when Patrick Donnelly, now 16 and the oldest of the remaining altar boys, approached his father with a story that would shatter the fragile facade of normalcy that Sacred Heart had maintained for so long. Patrick had always been intelligent and perceptive, qualities that had initially made him Father Ali's favorite altar boy. But those same qualities had eventually allowed him to see through the priest's carefully constructed deceptions and recognize the true nature of what was happening in the basement of St. Joseph's Church. What he revealed to his father that night, speaking in whispers behind the locked door of their cottage, painted a picture of systematic abuse disguised as religious instruction and predatory behavior masked as spiritual guidance. The private sessions, Patrick explained, had begun normally enough with additional training in Latin pronunciation and instruction in the more complex aspects of Catholic ritual. But gradually, Father Ali had introduced elements that seemed to come from sources outside traditional Catholic practice. The boys were taught ancient prayers in languages that predated Latin, shown symbols that the priest claimed represented the true cross used by the earliest Christian communities, and instructed in breathing techniques that were supposed to enhance their spiritual sensitivity. These sessions took place in chambers beneath the church basement that Patrick swore hadn't existed during Father McKenna's time. The rooms were carved from living rock and decorated with symbols that hurt to look at directly, as if the human eye wasn't designed to process such geometry. Candles burned with flames that cast shadows in the wrong directions, and the air was thick with incense that smelled of flowers and decay in equal measure. Most horrifying of all, Patrick claimed that the missing boys weren't gone. They were still in the church, changed by what Father Ali called the true communion. He had seen them during the midnight ceremonies, their eyes reflecting light like animals, and their movements controlled by a will other than their own. They spoke in voices that sounded like multiple people talking in unison, and they served the priest in ways that made Patrick violently ill when he tried to describe them. "They're not dead," he whispered to his father, his face pale as candle wax and his hands shaking with remembered terror. "But they're not alive either, not in any way that matters. Father Ali calls them his eternal altar boys, and he says that someday all of us will join them in service that never ends. He's been preparing me, Da. Special lessons about accepting transformation and embracing the sacred hunger. He says I'm almost ready." James Donnelly, a man whose faith had sustained him through the horrors of the potato famine and the challenges of building a new life in America, found himself facing a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his days. To believe his son meant accepting that their beloved priest was something monstrous, that their church had become a hunting ground, and that the faith they had used to define their identity was being weaponized against their own children. To dismiss Patrick's account meant potentially sacrificing his eldest son to whatever evil had already claimed 5 other boys. The decision he made would divide the community of sacred heart and set in motion events that would expose the truth about Father Cornelius Ali and reveal that the horrors hidden beneath St. Joseph's Church were far worse than even Patrick's nightmares had suggested. The confrontation that would tear Sacred Heart apart began not with violence or accusation, but with 3 fathers sitting around James Donnelly's kitchen table on a cold February night in 1851, sharing whiskey and gathering courage for what they all knew might be the most dangerous decision of their lives. Sean O'Connor sat hunched over his glass, his coal-stained hands trembling slightly as he spoke about the sounds that haunted his nights. Michael Walsh, whose boy Timothy had developed that persistent stutter after joining the altar boys, stared into the fire and shared observations that had been eating at his conscience for months, and James himself revealed his son Patrick's terrifying account of what really happened during those private sessions in the church basement. They were not reckless men or natural rebels. These were immigrants who had learned to keep their heads down and avoid confronting authority. Men who understood that challenging the wrong person could mean losing their jobs, their homes, and their place in the only community that would accept them. But they were also fathers, and the protective instinct that had driven them across an ocean to build new lives for their families was now screaming that their children were in mortal danger. "We can't go to the sheriff," O'Connor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Protestant lawmen won't listen to Catholic concerns. And even if he did, what proof do we have? Strange sounds in the night, children having nightmares, a priest who's maybe too friendly with the boys. They'd laugh us out of the county courthouse and we'd be marked as troublemakers." Walsh nodded grimly. "And we can't write to the bishop either. Ali's got documents with Kendrick's seal, letters of recommendation that look official enough. If we accuse him of whatever this is without proof, they'll transfer us to another parish or worse. Could lose our jobs, our homes. Whole community could be scattered." James Donnelly took a long pull from his whiskey glass and felt the burn in his throat match the fire of determination building in his chest. "Then we get proof," he said simply. "We find out what's really happening in that basement and we document it. Whatever Ali is doing to our boys, we expose it." The plan they devised was simple but terrifying in its implications. They would conduct surveillance of the church during the nights when Patrick reported that the special ceremonies took place, gathering evidence of any inappropriate activities. If they found proof of abuse or misconduct, they would present it to church authorities in Pittsburgh, along with testimony from their sons. If they found nothing, they would accept that their fears were unfounded and submit to whatever consequences their suspicions had earned them. But as they made their preparations over the following weeks, collecting oil lamps, checking the loading of Sean's old hunting rifle, and coordinating their schedules to ensure all 3 could participate, they began to uncover additional evidence that their worst fears might not be paranoid delusions after all. Timothy Walsh's medical condition, for instance, proved to be more serious than a simple childhood stutter. The family doctor, an elderly German immigrant named Klaus Brennan, who served the scattered Catholic communities throughout the region, had examined the boy and found symptoms that puzzled his considerable experience. Timothy's reflexes were abnormally slow. His pupils often dilated even in bright light, and his body temperature ran consistently lower than normal, conditions that Dr. Brennan associated with certain types of poisoning or prolonged exposure to toxic substances. More disturbing were the scars that the doctor discovered during his examination. Small, precise cuts on Timothy's arms and chest that formed patterns too regular to be accidental injuries. When questioned about these marks, the boy claimed they were sacred symbols that Father Ali had carved during blessing ceremonies to protect him from demonic influence. The cuts were healing cleanly and showed no signs of infection, suggesting they had been made with sterilized instruments by someone with medical knowledge. Patrick Donnelly's condition was even more alarming. His father had noticed that the boy often seemed to be listening to voices that no one else could hear. turning his head toward empty spaces and responding to questions that hadn't been asked. When pressed about this behavior, Patrick explained that Father Ali had taught him to hear the voices of the saints who provided guidance for those spiritually advanced enough to receive their communications, but the voices weren't always benevolent, Patrick admitted during one of his more lucid moments. Sometimes they whispered about the hunger that lives beneath and the price that must be paid for true communion. They told him about the other altar boys, describing where they had gone and what they had become in service to something that the voices called the Ancient Shepherd, a being that predated Christ but had learned to wear Christian symbols, like a wolf wearing sheep's clothing. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror in Sacred Heart intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in the nightmare that consumed St. Joseph's Church. The night of March 15, 1851, 4 days before the anniversary of Michael Flanagan's disappearance, the three fathers positioned themselves in the woods surrounding St. Joseph's Church, armed with weapons, witnesses, and a terrible determination to learn the truth about what had been happening to their children. What they discovered in the hours that followed would challenge everything they thought they knew about good and evil, faith and corruption, and the lengths to which a predator would go to satisfy hungers that normal human beings couldn't even imagine. Sean O'Connor took position behind the mausoleum in the church cemetery, where he could observe the main entrance and any movement between the church and the surrounding buildings. Michael Walsh concealed himself near the bell tower with a clear view of the basement windows that Patrick claimed were sometimes illuminated during the midnight ceremonies. James Donnelly, carrying his son's detailed description of the basement layout, planned to approach the church directly and attempt to observe whatever activities might be taking place in the chambers below. The first 3 hours passed in silence, with only the normal sounds of a rural night and the distant howling of wolves in the surrounding forest. The men began to wonder if their fears had been groundless, if they were chasing shadows created by grief and suspicion rather than confronting a real threat to their children. But at approximately 2 in the morning, lights appeared in the basement windows of St. Joseph's Church, and the sounds that drifted across the cemetery made their blood run cold. It began as chanting, but not in any Latin that their years of Catholic worship had taught them to recognize. The words seemed to twist in the air, creating harmonics that made their teeth ache and their vision blur. Underneath the vocal sounds was a rhythmic beating like a drum, but with an organic quality that suggested something other than animal hide was being struck. And threading through it all was a high, sweet sound that took them several minutes to identify as children's voices singing in perfect unison words that no Christian child should know. Michael Walsh, positioned closest to the basement windows, reported later that the lights visible through the glass weren't the steady glow of oil lamps or candles, but flickering illumination that changed color as he watched. Sometimes the warm yellow of normal flame, sometimes the cold blue-white of winter lightning, and occasionally a deep red that reminded him of blood viewed through colored glass. But it was James Donnelly who witnessed the most disturbing events of that night. Approaching the church from the side where Patrick had shown him a basement entrance that was usually locked, he found the door standing slightly ajar and warm air flowing from the opening despite the February cold. The smells that emerged from that portal were a mixture of incense, burning wax, and something organic that reminded him of the charnel house where pigs were slaughtered during the autumn harvest. Gathering his courage, James descended the stone steps that led into the basement of St. Joseph's Church, following the sounds and lights toward chambers that shouldn't have existed according to the building's original plans. What he saw in the depths beneath their place of worship would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life and challenge every assumption he had ever made about the nature of evil and the vulnerability of innocence. The basement had been transformed into something that belonged more in the pagan temples of ancient Rome than in a 19th century Catholic church. The walls were covered with symbols carved deep into the stone, designs that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering candlelight as if they were alive. Candles burned in arrangements that formed geometric patterns too complex for accidental placement, their flames casting shadows that moved independently of the objects that should have created them. At the center of the largest chamber stood an altar made from a single piece of black stone, its surface polished to mirror smoothness and stained with substances that James preferred not to identify. Around this altar, moving in a slow circle that followed the rhythm of the drumming, were 7 figures in white robes. But these weren't the simple surplices worn by altar boys during normal church services. These garments were decorated with the same twisted symbols that covered the walls, embroidered in threads that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was the faces beneath those hoods that broke something fundamental in James Donnelly's understanding of reality. 5 of the 7 figures were the missing altar boys, Michael Flanagan, Tommy Sullivan, and the others who had supposedly been sent to distant seminaries or missionary postings. But they had been changed in ways that went beyond simple physical alteration. Their eyes reflected light like those of nocturnal animals. Their movements were perfectly synchronized as if controlled by a single mind, and when they opened their mouths to continue the chanting, the sounds that emerged seemed to come from multiple throats, speaking in unison. The 6th figure was his own son, Patrick, moving with the same mechanical precision as the others, but still recognizably himself, evidence that whatever transformation process was being used hadn't been completed yet. And leading the procession, his silver hair gleaming in the unnatural light, and his blue eyes filled with an intelligence that seemed far older than his apparent age, was Father Cornelius Ali. But the priest James had known for over 5 years was gone, replaced by something wearing his form like an ill-fitting garment. The man conducting this obscene ceremony moved with fluid grace that seemed to defy the normal limitations of human anatomy, spoke in voices that layered upon themselves to create harmonies no single throat could produce, and radiated an authority that felt like a physical presence pressing down on everything in the chamber. As James watched in paralyzed horror, the ceremony reached some kind of crescendo. Ali raised his hands above the black altar, speaking words in a language that predated Latin by centuries, and the changed altar boys began to sing in voices that seemed to come from underground, from depths that extended far beyond the basement of any church. But Bishop Kendrick had come prepared for more than just a theological dispute. The documents he carried included not only evidence of Ali's false identity, but also detailed instructions for dealing with entities that had learned to wear human form while serving inhuman purposes. The ritual he performed wasn't an exorcism in the traditional sense, but something older and more specific, a binding that would force the creature to abandon its stolen identity and reveal its true nature. The result was horrifying beyond anything the witnesses had imagined possible. Ali's human appearance began to deteriorate like a mask melting in fire, revealing something underneath that belonged to no classification of life that natural science recognized. His skin became translucent, showing dark veins that pulsed with rhythm too fast for a human heart. His eyes multiplied, opening at his temples and the back of his neck like windows into spaces that shouldn't exist. And his voice, when he screamed his rage at being exposed, shattered every piece of glass in the church and drove 3 of the investigating priests to their knees with hands pressed over their bleeding ears. But the most devastating moment came when the binding ritual reached its climax and the spell that had transformed the altar boys was broken. The 7 children collapsed simultaneously, their bodies convulsing as whatever had been controlling them was forcibly expelled. When they finally stopped moving and opened their eyes, 5 of them stared at the ceiling with the vacant gaze of the truly dead, while 2, including Patrick Donnelly, began screaming with voices that sounded like children again for the first time in months. The thing that had called itself Father Cornelius Ali made one final attempt to maintain its hold over Sacred Heart, speaking words that tried to reimpose the mental dominance it had exercised over the community for years. But its power had been broken by the exposure of its true nature, and instead of compliance, It faced a congregation that was finally seeing clearly after years of spiritual manipulation. James Donnelly, freed from the supernatural influence that had kept him passive despite his growing suspicions, grabbed his son Patrick and ran from the church, followed by other parents who suddenly understood what had been done to their children. Behind them, the creature's screams of rage and frustration echoed across the Pennsylvania hills, like the sound of damnation itself being denied its promised harvest. The official church records of what happened at St. Joseph's Church on March 19, 1851, were sealed by order of the Vatican and wouldn't be opened for examination until 1998, when changing attitudes toward institutional transparency forced the Catholic hierarchy to acknowledge some of its darkest secrets. The documents revealed that the case of the false Father Ali was part of a pattern that church investigators had been tracking for decades. Entities of unknown origin that had learned to infiltrate religious communities by assuming the identities of legitimate clergy. Bishop Kendrick's final report, written in the careful language of ecclesiastical diplomacy, described the perpetrator as a malevolent intelligence of non-human origin that had developed sophisticated methods for exploiting the trust and faith of isolated Catholic communities. The report noted that the entity had demonstrated abilities that defied natural law, including apparent immortality, shape-shifting capabilities, and the power to exert psychological control over large groups of people for extended periods. But the most disturbing aspect of the case wasn't the supernatural elements. It was the systematic way the creature had used the Catholic Church's own structure and beliefs to facilitate its predation. By assuming clerical authority, it had gained access to children whose parents would never question a priest's intentions. By invoking religious obedience, it had silenced potential victims and their families, and by operating within an institution that valued faith over skepticism, it had created an environment where warning signs were interpreted as tests of devotion rather than calls for investigation. The 5 altar boys who died during the binding ritual were given Catholic burial in Sacred Heart Cemetery, but their families were told they had succumbed to a virulent fever that had swept through the region. The truth about their prolonged torment and the circumstances of their deaths was deemed too traumatic for public consumption and too damaging to the church's reputation among immigrant communities who depended on religious institutions for social cohesion and spiritual comfort. Patrick Donnelly survived, but the boy who returned to his father's house bore little resemblance to the cheerful child who had once dreamed of becoming a priest. The months of psychological manipulation and supernatural influence had left him with permanent neurological damage that manifested as seizures, memory gaps, and episodes of catatonic withdrawal that could last for days. He never spoke about what had happened during his time as an altar boy, but he would wake screaming from nightmares that involved underground chambers and voices that called his name from empty spaces. Timothy Walsh, the other survivor, recovered more completely but was left with a severe stutter that made normal conversation difficult and a persistent tremor in his hands that prevented him from pursuing his family's trade as a blacksmith. He eventually became a hermit, living alone in a cabin deep in the Pennsylvania forests and avoiding human contact except for monthly trips to town for supplies. Local residents reported that he could sometimes be heard talking to himself during these visits, carrying on conversations with people who weren't there and answering questions in voices that didn't sound like his own. Community of Sacred Heart never recovered from the trauma of discovering that their spiritual leader had been a predator in disguise. Families scattered to other settlements throughout western Pennsylvania, carrying their shame and silence to new churches where they learned to speak of their time at St. Joseph's as a period of spiritual confusion that was best forgotten. The church building itself was deconsecrated and sold to the county government, which converted it into a storage facility for road maintenance equipment and sealed the basement with concrete to prevent unauthorized access. But sealing the basement couldn't contain the psychological contamination that had spread through Sacred Heart during Ali's tenure. Several families reported continuing supernatural phenomena in their new homes. Children who spoke in languages they had never learned, household objects that moved without explanation, and voices that whispered from empty rooms during the darkest hours of the night. Dr. Klaus Brennan, the physician who had examined Timothy Walsh, documented cases of what he termed residual spiritual influence affecting multiple members of the Sacred Heart diaspora, symptoms that persisted for years after their escape from the false priest's control. The creature that had assumed Father Ali's identity was never captured or definitively destroyed. Bishop Kendrick's binding ritual had forced it to abandon its human disguise and flee from Sacred Heart, but church investigators found evidence suggesting it had simply moved to a new location and begun the process of assuming another clerical identity. Reports from parishes throughout the Midwest described visiting priests whose credentials seemed impeccable, but whose methods raised subtle questions among observant parishioners. In 1867, 16 years after the Sacred Heart incident, a similar pattern of altar boy disappearances was reported from a German Catholic community in Wisconsin. The investigating priest found evidence of basement chambers that shouldn't have existed according to architectural records, ritual symbols carved into church walls, and testimony from survivors describing ceremonies that combined Christian liturgy with practices that belonged to much older traditions. But by the time church authorities arrived to investigate, the priest responsible had vanished, leaving behind only empty chambers and the traumatized remnants of another shattered community. The final chapter in the St. Joseph's case wasn't written until 1923, when the old church building was finally demolished to make way for a new county courthouse. Workers discovered that the basement extended far deeper than the original building plans indicated, with chambers carved from living rock that showed signs of recent occupation despite being sealed for over 70 years. The walls were covered with symbols that matched those described in Bishop Kendrick's report, but they appeared to have been carved recently, rather than during the 1850s. Most disturbing of all was the discovery of personal items belonging to children who had gone missing from surrounding communities during the previous decade, items arranged in ritual patterns around stone altars stained with substances that resisted chemical analysis. The workers also reported finding 14 sets of small bones buried beneath the basement floor, arranged in geometric patterns around a central chamber that showed evidence of repeated ceremonial use. The bones were given Christian burial in Sacred Heart's new cemetery, but the workers who handled them reported experiencing nightmares for months afterward, dreams of children singing Latin hymns in voices that echoed from underground chambers, and shadows that moved independently of the objects that cast them. Several of the construction crew quit their jobs rather than continue working on the courthouse project, claiming they could hear whispers coming from the excavation site during night shifts. Dr. Margaret Thornton, a forensic anthropologist who examined the remains at the request of local authorities, determined that the bones belonged to children aged between 8 and 16 who had died over a period spanning several decades. The most recent remains showed evidence of death occurring within the previous 5 years, suggesting that whatever had happened at St. Joseph's in the 1850s had continued long after the church was supposedly sealed and abandoned. Her report, filed with both civil authorities and the Catholic Diocese of Pittsburgh, included a recommendation that the entire courthouse site be consecrated by appropriate religious officials before construction continued. The recommendation was quietly ignored, but workers on the project reported continuing supernatural incidents. Tools that moved overnight, foundation concrete that cracked in patterns that resembled the ritual symbols found in the basement, and the persistent sound of children's voices singing during the early morning hours when the construction site should have been empty. The courthouse was completed in 1924 and served the county government for nearly 8 decades, but employees reported a higher than average rate of psychological problems, mysterious illnesses, and job turnover throughout its operational history. The building was finally abandoned in 2003 after a series of structural problems that engineers couldn't explain, and it remained empty until the renovation project that uncovered the lead-lined box containing Bishop Kendrick's sealed documents. This mystery shows us that evil can wear the most trusted faces, that predators can hide behind the very institutions we depend on for protection and guidance. The 14 altar boys of St. Joseph's were betrayed not just by a monster in human form, but by a system that valued faith over skepticism and institutional reputation over the safety of children. Their story reminds us that true vigilance requires the courage to question authority when our protective instincts tell us something is wrong, even when that questioning challenges the foundations of our beliefs. What do you think of this story? Do you believe the entity that called itself Father Ali found new communities to prey upon? Or was it finally stopped by forces beyond human understanding? Have you ever encountered situations where trusted authority figures demanded unquestioning obedience that made you uncomfortable? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories that reveal the dark secrets hidden in America's religious history, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries that chill the soul. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another buried truth that powerful institutions hoped would never see the light of day.